When COVID hit and the first $2 trillion package came to the floor, there weren't $2 trillion to borrow. It didn't exist in circulation. So what happened? How did we finance that debt? How do we finance that $2 trillion and the next $2 trillion and the next trillion? In fact, we financed $5 trillion of this debt by printing money. The Federal Reserve printed the money, and then the Treasury borrowed it from the Federal Reserve. So we kind of borrowed it from ourselves, but what came into existence was $5 trillion that did not exist before. But what we did over the last 3 years is increase by $5 trillion the amount of money that's in circulation. Before the banks loaned it out fractionally. This was specifically for COVID. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion. If you look at their graph, it's kind of flat for since 1917, their balance sheet. Then it went up $5 trillion right there. This is what happens when you have a quantity of something and then you add more to it. This is dilution. The principle is so simple that a child can understand. And you can create this little science project at home. Sorry, you can have your tea back. Okay. But the principle is called dilution. And when you print $5 trillion and you put it into the economy, you have diluted the value of the money. So for instance, if you had a minimum wage at some amount and somebody was making minimum wage and they were still making minimum wage after this money was printed, they actually are making considerably less in terms of real dollars. It's dilution. So the $5 trillion that we printed, I would argue, is the primary source of inflation. You know, we can say, well, eggs went up because feed went up, fuel went up because there's a war in Ukraine. You can find a lot of excuses for various different industries. But what is the probability that every price went up all at the same time? You can't blame them on specific supply chain problems because they did the same thing in Europe. They did this everywhere. They printed their own equivalents of the Federal Reserve and treasuries, created their own money out of thin air. Mm-hmm. It may be the only thing that saved our dollar is that everybody else did the same thing to their currency. Inflation is extremely regressive, especially when it affects the goods that everybody needs to buy. Energy. I love it when they print the consumer price index, neglecting food and energy and housing, right? Like the three things that no matter how poor you are, you still need. We'll just leave those out when we look at the effect of inflation, but you can't leave those things out. So the reason we're not, we could just print more money again like we did over the last 3 years, but the reality is everybody in this room knows, and if we don't, we have staff who know, that if you print money, you're gonna wreck this economy. When you gave people money, the farmers didn't make more goods, the factories didn't make more goods, the refineries didn't refine more oil. Demand for fuel went down, so we saw a temporary, if you look at inflation, it actually went down there for a while nobody was doing much of anything. But after we put that money in their hands, now they're chasing goods that don't exist. They literally buying the inventory because so many things were shut down. If you remember where I began, $5 trillion was created by the Federal Reserve. And then, which we said, thank you very much. We'll take those 5 trillion new imaginary dollars that spend just like real dollars, and we'll, actually, we didn't put a lot of that money into the hands of consumers. They got maybe 12% of it, 20% if you count the unemployment programs. Most of it went to big companies. But so then we took the $5 trillion the Federal Reserve created and caused massive inflation with the Federal Reserve printing that money. Now who's here to save the day? The Federal Reserve comes in on a white horse. Oh, look at this fire, this raging fire called inflation. We're gonna put it out. We've got just the tool. We're gonna hose down the economy. So anyways, I just hope everybody recognizes that the firefighters, i.e. the Fed, are the arsonists who started this problem by creating $5 trillion out of thin air. And here's what makes me so concerned. How are we going to finance the additional $800 billion of interest? Are we going to raise taxes? I don't think we are. I think we're going.
Gentleman, you?
In just a second, I think we're going to print more money. And what's that going to do? It's going to raise inflation. And what will the Fed do to try to control inflation? They will raise interest rates. What's going to happen then? We're going to have higher interest on our own debt. We're going to print more money. I think we're at the beginning of a vicious cycle that's not going to calm down for a while. And I'll yield to Mr. Neguse.
Yeah,